Welcome to Founding Chronicles. Before we dive into today's chilling story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe, and hit that bell icon so you never miss a tale from America's past. Also, we'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments below. Now let's step back in time to a small New England town where one Thanksgiving would become unforgettable. Not for the feast, but for the dark story of Esther Carter, the cook who boiled a colonel and his 3 sons. This is a story of years of silent suffering, cunning patience, and a revenge that history has never forgotten. The kitchen was Esther Carter's sanctuary and her prison, all at once. The scent of herbs, the roar of the hearth, and the steady rhythm of chopping and stirring had become the pulse of her life. Born in a small New England town, Esther had grown up in a household where silence was prized, obedience demanded, and laughter was rare. She learned early that her life was measured not by joy, but by usefulness. Cooking became her language, her rebellion, and her only way to be noticed. Every simmering pot and every carefully rolled dough was a statement. She existed, she mattered, even if the world around her pretended otherwise. By the time she was in her late 20s, Esther had earned a reputation as a cook of unusual skill. Her sauces were rich, her breads golden and fragrant, and her pies, oh, her pies, were said to hold a kind of magic that could silence quarrels at the table and draw even the hardest men into smiles. She worked for families who prided themselves on lineage and land where every meal was a demonstration of status. It was at one such household that she met Colonel Jonathan Whitmore and his 3 sons. The Whitmores were proud men, steeped in tradition, and deaf to the quiet suffering of those who served them. Colonel Whitmore himself was a towering figure, stern and unyielding, with eyes that seemed to weigh each word and movement of those beneath him. His sons mirrored him in arrogance. Thomas, the eldest, cruel in his jests and quick to anger. William, the middle, smooth-tongued but just as cold, and Edward, the youngest, wild-eyed, unpredictable, and violent in ways that kept everyone on edge. Together, they were a force of terror for anyone in their house, and Esther, despite her skill, had been pushed to the edge of endurance by years of humiliation, ridicule, and veiled threats. Her life had been a slow accumulation of small indignities. She remembered vividly the first time Thomas had laughed at her with a friend while she carried a tray of roast and vegetables. "Do you know the dog in the yard is smarter than you, girl?" he sneered, tossing the napkin he had so carelessly knocked off the table. That evening, as she cleaned the hearth, she had pressed her hands against the warm bricks, willing herself to remember, someday, they would feel the weight of what they had done to her. That thought, nurtured in silence and shadow, had become a steady ember in her mind. Esther's neighbors whispered about her quietness, about the way she spoke little but listened endlessly. Children who passed her kitchen window claimed they could see fire behind her calm eyes, a quiet warning that no one could understand. Yet she was careful. Too careful, perhaps. She had learned the art of appearing small while harboring a storm within. And that storm, as years passed, had been fed by every insult, every bruise to her pride, and every humiliation that came with servitude to the Whitmores. The days before that fateful Thanksgiving had been colder than usual, the wind cutting across the farm like a sharp blade. Esther moved with precision, her hands steady as she prepared the meal. She ground spices, rolled dough, and trimmed vegetables with a focus that hid the growing fury inside her. The colonel had been unusually harsh that week, barking orders that made even the eldest son flinch. Thomas demanded the turkey be plucked perfectly, William criticized the seasoning of every side dish, and Edward, with his reckless temper, tossed a pan across the kitchen for a minor slip. Each outburst sank into Esther's mind like, stones into a pond, stirring ripples of anger she had long kept beneath the surface. But beneath her simmering resentment, there was also a deep, aching sadness. Esther had once dreamed of a life filled with family, laughter, and respect. She had imagined a small house, perhaps a garden that she could tend, and a hearth that welcomed warmth rather than fear. That dream had been extinguished slowly, snuffed out by men who had no idea of the life they were crushing, who never saw the girl behind the apron as a human being worthy of dignity. And as she stirred the turkey stock that morning, she thought of that lost life, and of the men who had stolen it from her day by day, year by year. She paused, hand on the edge of the table, staring into the pot as if it held the answers to questions she had never dared ask aloud. In her mind, she imagined their faces, every cruel laugh and harsh command etched clearly. She remembered the smell of tobacco smoke in the study where she had been scolded for asking for a moment of rest, the sound of Thomas snapping his fingers impatiently when she carried a dish too slowly, and the glint in Edward's eye when he threw the first pan. Every memory was a brushstroke, painting the scene of what she believed needed to happen. It was not madness, she told herself. It was justice, long delayed, meticulous in its unfolding. By noon, the Whitmore family had begun to gather in the main hall, unaware of the storm brewing in the kitchen. Esther moved among the pots and pans, her mind racing with calculation. Every spice, every inch of fat, every drop of oil was a tool, a means to an end that she had plotted with the patience of years. No one could have guessed what lay beneath her calm exterior, her measured steps, and her serene face. The servants who scurried past her whispered about the odd intensity in her eyes, but even they could not decipher the true depth of her plan. Thanksgiving arrived with all its expected pomp. The colonel demanded perfection, his sons barking complaints before the first bite. The house smelled of roasted meat, burning wood, and sweet pies, a false sense of normalcy masking the tension that had been simmering for decades. Esther moved through the room as if part of the ritual, yet inside, she counted each moment, each heartbeat, each step that brought the men closer to the fate she had envisioned. She could feel the past years of oppression condensing into a single, terrible resolve. In the quiet moments before the meal began, Esther allowed herself a small, private glance at the door leading to the oil vat. It gleamed ominously in the corner of the kitchen, a silent accomplice in her plan. Her fingers brushed over the lid as if testing the weight of her destiny. Her heart pounded, not with fear, but with anticipation. Years of silent suffering, of unnoticed labor, of scorn, and humiliation all culminated in this moment. She drew a deep breath, tasting the sweetness of the oil mingled with the bitter tang of revenge. She had always believed that history remembers the bold, and in that moment, Esther Carter felt herself poised to become more than a servant, more than a shadow in the hallways of men who thought themselves untouchable. She was aware of the enormity of what she was about to do, yet she felt strangely calm, even euphoric. There was a clarity in her mind, a stark understanding that she was not merely a cook preparing a meal, but a woman rewriting the story of her life in the only way left to her. And so, as the Whitmores sat down, demanding silverware and their portion of the feast, Esther Carter stood silently in the kitchen, the fire reflecting in her eyes. She stirred the oil one last time, listening to the echoes of laughter and the clatter of dishes. Each sound became a note in a grim symphony, a precursor to the moment that would mark the end of the colonel and his sons. This was not a tale of impulse. It was a culmination, decades in the making, a dark feast carefully planned by a woman who had endured every cruelty imaginable. The dining hall was a theater of oblivion. Colonel Whitmore and his sons sat at the long, polished table, each drumming their fingers, shifting impatiently, exchanging sharp words, and making jabs at one another. Their voices carried into the kitchen, where Esther's hands moved with mechanical precision, yet her mind was fully present in the rhythm of her plan. She could feel the past weighing heavily on her, each cruel word, each mockery, each slap of authority compressed into a singular, unstoppable momentum. Today was Thanksgiving, a day meant for gratitude and warmth, yet for Esther, it had become the day of reckoning. She carried dishes to the table with the utmost care, as if the normalcy of her service could disguise the storm she had orchestrated. Her expression was composed, almost serene, though her fingers tingled with anticipation. She had chosen every ingredient carefully, every measure deliberate. The oil had been heated to the exact temperature she needed, a monstrous agent hidden, in plain sight beneath the mundane task of cooking. To the Whitmores, it was just another preparation, another gesture of service. To Esther, it was justice in liquid form, boiling and ready to deliver what words and years of silent endurance never could. The colonel leaned back in his chair, his commanding presence filling the room, while his sons laughed at trivial jokes and pointed fingers, each trying to assert dominance over the others. Thomas criticized the seasoning of the mashed potatoes. William mocked Edward's inability to carve the turkey properly, and Edward's retort was sharp and reckless, filled with the kind of bravado that came from knowing no one dared challenge him. Every insult and jab, every petty quarrel, stoked the fire inside Esther, feeding a clarity of purpose she had cultivated over years. She moved like a shadow between the kitchen and the dining hall, unseen but fully aware of every action, every breath, every heartbeat. She placed the dishes in front of them, her movements fluid, almost ritualistic. The Whitmores barely looked at her, too absorbed in their petty squabbles to notice the woman who had spent decades in their service, whose existence had been defined by their approval or disapproval. Esther's heart thrummed with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. She felt the weight of history pressing down on her, the collective years of suffering that had made her ready for this moment. The oil, bubbling and deadly, waited silently in the kitchen, a coiled serpent ready to strike. As the meal progressed, the men argued over who would carve the turkey. The colonel's voice boomed, full of impatience and authority, demanding that his sons settle their bickering and attend to the meal with decorum. The boys exchanged angry glares, their pride wounded, their tempers frayed. Each move they made seemed designed to provoke Esther further, to remind her of the hierarchy she had spent a lifetime enduring. But today, the hierarchy would be shattered. Esther moved behind them under the guise of attending to the gravy, her hands steady as she poured the thick, aromatic sauce over the potatoes. She kept her face neutral, betraying nothing of the tempest inside. The colonel's hand reached for the turkey, oblivious to the danger that awaited him in the kitchen. Thomas laughed at a joke William had made, slapping the table so hard that the silverware rattled. Edward leaned back, a smug grin spreading across his face. They were completely unaware of the darkness in the kitchen, of the meticulous care Esther had taken to transform her tools of labor into instruments of vengeance. Her mind wandered briefly to memories of her childhood, the moments of loneliness and despair that had shaped her into the woman she had become. She remembered being scolded for speaking out of turn, punished for mistakes that were not hers, and dismissed for feelings that were human and valid. Each memory was a brushstroke painting the urgency of her task, making her resolve even stronger. She had endured countless indignities, and now the time had come for the scales to tip, for her to assert her existence in the most radical and irreversible way possible. Esther could hear their laughter carrying into the corners of the kitchen, see their faces glowing in the firelight, and sense the full weight of their arrogance. They believed themselves untouchable, invincible, men whose station and power shielded them from the consequences of their cruelty. How little they understood the quiet power of the one they had underestimated for so long. Each gesture, each careless laugh, each dismissive look only deepened her determination. She returned to the oil vat, her hands steady despite the adrenaline that surged through her veins. The temperature was perfect. Every preparation, every step she had taken in the past week had led to this moment. She could almost hear the echo of every insult that had ever been hurled at her in the house, every time she had been ignored, laughed at, or punished for daring to exist. That echo became a drumbeat in her mind, a cadence that drove her actions forward with deliberate precision. She paused briefly, her eyes lingering on the glimmering surface of the oil, and allowed herself a moment of reflection. She was no longer just a cook. She was a woman who had endured and survived, who had been forced to cultivate patience in the face of cruelty and humiliation. Today, she would transform that patience into power, that suffering into agency. The irony was not lost on her. The very hands that had served and been demeaned for decades were now instruments of ultimate authority. As the colonel and his sons argued over the smallest details of the feast, Esther moved with quiet certainty. Her hands, steady and purposeful, carried each component of her plan into place. The final steps would require precision, timing, and nerves of steel, but she was ready. Every moment of preparation, every detail of her strategy had been honed over years of observation and experience. The kitchen, once a space of endless toil and silent suffering, had become the site of impending justice. And in that moment, Esther felt the full weight of her resolve. She was aware of the enormity of what she was about to do, yet she was calm, collected, and determined. The men laughed and bickered, oblivious to the storm that awaited them, while she readied herself to deliver a reckoning decades in the making. It was not rage alone that drove her, nor madness, but the profound clarity of a life shaped by cruelty, now turned toward a singular, inescapable purpose. Every tick of the clock brought her closer to the moment. Every flicker of the candlelight, every clatter of silverware, every sharp tone in the room was a reminder that history was about to bend, even if only within the walls of that household. Esther Carter, the quiet, overlooked cook, would soon redefine her existence in the most irreversible and devastating way. And the colonel and his sons, blind to her presence, blind to her years of suffering, would discover too late the terrifying power of a life underestimated. The room was filled with the aroma of roasted turkey, fresh bread, and sweet pies, yet underneath the pleasant scents lay a tension so thick it could have been cut with a knife. Colonel Whitmore and his sons continued their petty quarrels, unaware that every second that passed was bringing them closer to the consequences of their cruelty. Esther moved silently behind them, a ghost among the clamor of the family's arrogance. Her eyes, calm yet alight with intensity, tracked every movement, every shift in posture, every careless gesture that spoke of their overconfidence. She approached, the oil vat, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The oil shimmered in the light, hot and ready, a silent participant in the grim act she was about to commit. Years of humiliation, scorn, and oppression had coalesced into a single unyielding purpose. She had planned this day with meticulous care. Every detail, from the exact temperature of the oil to the timing of the meal, was part of a precise, horrifying choreography. The Whitmores, completely absorbed in their own world of ego and entitlement, had no idea what was coming. Thomas, the eldest, was busy boasting about his latest acquisition. William smirked at every reaction as if he were the cleverest man in the room, and Edward laughed recklessly at nothing, confident in the invulnerability granted by his family name. Each laugh, each careless movement fueled Esther's resolve. Her years of servitude had honed her patience into something dangerous, a quiet force that now threatened to erupt with devastating consequences. She lingered for a moment, observing them, committing every detail to memory. The cold calculation in her mind contrasted sharply with the heat of the oil and the fire in the hearth. She imagined each man's face, the shock, the disbelief, the realization that the world they had, dominated for so long, could shift in a single instant. Her heart, steady yet racing, carried a strange mix of fear and anticipation. This was the moment that would transform her from a life of overlooked labor into one of irreversible consequence. Esther approached the colonel, offering him the gravy she had prepared with painstaking care. His hand reached for it, and for a fleeting second, their eyes met. There was a flicker of recognition, perhaps a subconscious acknowledgement of the woman who had been in his shadow for so long. He saw nothing, truly nothing, of the storm that had been building in her for decades. That was his mistake, and it would be his undoing. The sons continued their bickering, their voices rising in volume and tension. Thomas knocked over a goblet, cursing loudly as William laughed at his blunder. Edward, still smirking, leaned back in his chair, tossing a napkin onto the floor with casual disregard. Each careless act was a nail in the coffin of their arrogance, a reminder of the years of cruelty that Esther had endured at their hands. The air seemed to pulse with anticipation, the space between the kitchen and the dining hall charged with an almost electric tension. With deliberate calm, Esther retrieved the ladle, the handle cool and solid in her grip. The oil had reached the perfect state, a lethal ally in her carefully constructed plan. She could feel its heat radiating against her skin, a physical reminder of the force she was about to unleash. Her mind wandered briefly to the moments that had brought her here, the endless chores, the mocking laughter, the scolding words, and the bruising hands that had tried to keep her small and silent. She allowed herself a quiet, almost reverent acknowledgement of the years that had shaped her, each memory a step along the path to this day. As she moved closer, the sounds of the meal became almost surreal, distant echoes in her consciousness. The clatter of silverware, the sharp tones of argument, and the booming voice of the colonel blended into a singular rhythmic cadence that seemed to guide her movements. Each step toward the oil vat, each careful motion, was part of a ritual she had practiced in her mind countless times. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty, only the stark clarity of purpose that had been cultivated through decades of suffering. Esther paused for a moment, taking in the scene one last time. The men, oblivious to the danger that lurked just beyond their awareness, continued their petty quarrels and reckless laughter. She studied their faces, noting the arrogance, the self-assuredness, the ignorance of those who had always believed themselves untouchable. Each expression, each careless gesture, reinforced the inevitability of what was about to unfold. Then, with a resolve as cold and precise as the steel of a blade, she made her move. The ladle dipped into the oil, carrying the culmination of years of planning and silent fury. Every instinct she had honed, every observation she had made over the years, converged in that single deliberate act. The kitchen, once a place of servitude and hidden resentment, had become the stage for a reckoning decades in the making. Time seemed to slow as she moved toward her first target. Her hand was steady, her mind focused, her heart beating in measured anticipation. The colonel, still unaware, gestured at a side dish, demanding attention, completely oblivious to the lethal reality closing in around him. Esther's lips pressed into a thin line. Her eyes locked on the moment when the culmination of her life's pain and planning would finally meet its manifestation. The oil hissed and bubbled, a sinister whisper of the fate awaiting those who had caused her so much suffering. Each man, wrapped in his arrogance and oblivion, became a symbol of every indignity she had endured. Her resolve was absolute. There was no turning back. The quiet, watchful years of her life had led her here, and every moment of hesitation had been eliminated through patient, meticulous preparation. As she moved with precise control, she could almost feel the weight of history pressing against her, the invisible acknowledgement that some acts, though horrifying, were born from the depths of human endurance and the inexorable desire for justice. Esther Carter, once overlooked and undervalued, was now the fulcrum upon which the fate of the Whitmore men would pivot. The air in the kitchen seemed to tremble, the firelight flickering across her face as if aware of the gravity of the moment. And in that charged silence, Esther prepared to strike, fully aware that the actions she was about to take would forever alter the lives in that room, the legacy of a family, and the story of her own existence. The line between survival and vengeance had blurred, and she had stepped firmly onto the path she had long contemplated. The dining hall was alive with laughter and argument, completely unaware that the quietest presence in the room held a storm of unimaginable consequence. Esther Carter moved like a shadow, her mind and body synchronized with the deadly plan she had perfected over decades. The oil hissed, heated to a lethal temperature, waiting for the moment it would carry the culmination of years of suffering, indignity, and silent rage. Her hands were steady. Her heart beat with a rhythm both terrifying and exhilarating, and every fiber of her being focused on the act that would forever change her life and theirs. She approached the colonel first, his stern eyes still scanning the table, his attention consumed by minor grievances and the superficial triumphs of his son's achievements. He didn't notice her step closer, didn't suspect the danger hidden in the woman he had long treated as invisible. Esther's grip on the ladle was firm, every movement deliberate. Her mind replayed every humiliation, every scornful glance, every insult that had been etched into her memory over years of silent servitude. All of it converged into this singular moment of resolution. The first splash of oil was precise. The hiss was loud, terrifying. Yet to Esther, it was a sound of liberation, of justice long delayed. The colonel's cry of shock and pain was immediate, cutting through the laughter and arguments like a jagged knife. Time seemed to slow, the room suspended in a horrific stillness, even as chaos erupted. Thomas, William, and Edward turned in disbelief, eyes wide, mouths open, unable to comprehend the transformation of their quiet, long-overlooked cook into an instrument of vengeance. Panic erupted in the room. Thomas tried to leap from his chair, but the floor was slick, the suddenness of the attack leaving him unbalanced. William shouted, grasping for anything to stop the disaster, while Edward's wild eyes reflected pure terror for the first time in his life. Their laughter and arrogance had been replaced by screams, confusion, and the primal realization of mortality. Each man's reaction only fueled Esther's grim satisfaction, the years of torment finding a sudden, terrifying outlet in the very people who had caused it. Esther moved with controlled precision, her every step choreographed, her mind a cold engine of purpose. She did not falter. She had envisioned this moment countless times, and now, as screams filled the room and the firelight danced across their faces, she executed every action with calculated ruthlessness. She was not cruel for the sake of cruelty. She was exacting justice in the only form left to her, reshaping the narrative of her life with each movement. The men's resistance was frantic but futile. Shock and the scalding heat of the oil overwhelmed them, their cries echoing through the house, mingling with the crackle of the hearth and the clatter of overturned silverware. Esther felt a strange mix of detachment and triumph, the culmination of years of silent suffering and unacknowledged skill unfolding in real time. Her life had been defined by their disregard, their cruelty, their thoughtless oppression, and now, at long last, she asserted her existence in a manner that demanded recognition, albeit in the most horrifying way imaginable. When the last of the chaos subsided, a heavy silence descended upon the household. The fire crackled in the hearth, the only sound in a room that had transformed from the theater of arrogance to the scene of absolute devastation. Esther stood, her apron stained, her hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the intensity of the experience. The Whitmores, the men who had believed themselves untouchable, lay still, the arrogance and cruelty that had defined them extinguished in moments. She looked around the dining hall, now a grim tableau of the consequences of pride and cruelty. The feast remained untouched, a haunting reminder of the ordinary lives that had once seemed so important, now overshadowed by an extraordinary act of retribution. Esther felt an unexpected weight settle on her shoulders. The act was done, irreversible, monumental in its finality. She had not been seeking fame, nor had she acted from a place of mindless rage. She had been reclaiming the dignity and agency denied to her for decades. The aftermath was a quiet that seemed almost unnatural. The servants who remained, those who had long lived in fear of the Whitmore's wrath, looked on in stunned silence, unsure whether to speak or flee. Esther moved among them, her presence commanding in a way that had never been acknowledged before. She did not gloat, did not boast. She simply existed in the room, the embodiment of a life that had been forced to endure but had ultimately found a voice through action. In the days that followed, the story of what had happened at the Whitmore household spread slowly at first, then with growing intensity. Neighbors whispered about the quiet cook who had endured years of cruelty and emerged as an almost mythical figure of vengeance. Some called her monstrous, others called her justice incarnate. But no one could deny the truth of what had occurred. Esther Carter had been underestimated, overlooked, and dismissed, and in one devastating act, she had rewritten the fates of those who had defined her life through oppression. And through it all, Esther remained the same woman who had always been in the shadows, observant, deliberate, quietly proud. She had done what she needed to do, acted with precision and inevitability, and in doing so had carved her own narrative into the history of a household that had long assumed itself untouchable. The cook who had once been invisible had left a mark no one would forget, a dark feast that would echo in memory long after the last embers of the hearth had died. The house, once alive with arrogance, was now a monument to the consequences of underestimating the quiet, the patient, and the overlooked. Esther stood at the center, no longer just a servant, no longer just a cook. She was a force shaped by years of suffering and careful planning, a reminder that even the most seemingly powerless can wield an unimaginable power when pushed to the edge. And so, the tale of Esther Carter, the cook who boiled a colonel and his 3 sons on Thanksgiving Day, became both legend and warning. A story of pain endured, patience exercised, and justice exacted with a precision that was as terrifying as it was inevitable. The echoes of that dark feast lingered in the minds of all who heard it, a haunting reminder that even the quietest among us can carry storms capable of changing history itself.